First of all, I'd like to begin by thanking Sophia so much, as well as the Center for the Study of Urban History of East Central Europe, as well as Taras and Taras Martinenko, who has also been incredibly helpful in my research, and also my two research assistants who are undergraduates at the University of Virginia, Ryan and Matt. Stand up, please. Ryan and Matt in the back. Give my hand, please. History is not a solitary endeavor, and without their help on this project and the Lwów mapping project, Lviv mapping project, we wouldn't be where we are now. So I really appreciate the help of all of these people and many others. It's really truly a privilege to be able to present some of my research on my new book project and my thoughts really to the public here in Lviv. That's a really amazing opportunity. It's my second visit to the city, and I have to say I've completely fallen in love with Lviv. It is one of my favorite cities in Eastern Europe. I truly love it. And I'm really looking forward to your questions. That's often the most valuable part for me as a scholar is feedback from other people, particularly now people who are residents of the city that I'm studying. My topic today is the Janowska concentration camp, and this camp witnessed unspeakable horrors and desperate courage, but really has not yet had a scholarly work devoted to it, which is perhaps odd or really very surprising given the depth of archival, memoir, testimonial, and visual source material, which is why I'm going to be writing a book on it. Before shedding light on this camp, though, I'm going to attempt to discuss two critical aspects of my research as it unfolds. The first concerns the very nature of the camp itself, what I'm going to call a hybrid camp. Holocaust scholars recognize that there were around 40,000 Nazi concentration camps, which took a dizzying variety of forms and functions. However, we also rightfully distinguish these places from the 6 extermination centers, and these are Chełmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz. The distinction here is that the latter generally had the sole purpose of the industrialized extermination of Jews. Janowska, however, defies this categorization in interesting ways. It functioned simultaneously as a slave labor, transit, and extermination center for Lviv and the surrounding region. Somewhere around 80,000 Jews may have been murdered there. Majdanek is the only camp of comparable size that had a similar role that I know of. Auschwitz was certainly a hybrid camp, but on a scale that doesn't really compare to Janowska. Other camps, too, had periods when they filled multiple functions. So some might argue that the distinction I am making is academic or semantic. However, I think that understanding the multifaceted nature of the Janowska camp can powerfully illuminate Nazi policy at the ground level, but also in the context of what I call the larger Nazi genocidal project, particularly in the Galicia region. The camp and its personnel played a role in slave labor, in deportations to extermination centers, in managing and liquidating ghettos in the region. It was the site of sexual violence against Jewish women, a topic only now receiving the attention it deserves. The Janowska camp participated in the expropriation of Jewish property and saw the most violent forms of Jewish resistance. In addition, the camp profited from collaboration, employing Ukrainian guards and benefiting from the support of the local population. And at the end, Janowska played a leading role in the Nazi attempt to erase evidence of its crimes before its last survivors, including Simon Wiesenthal, left Lviv on death marches to the west. It is not an exaggeration to say that Janowska and Lviv were at the center of the Holocaust in Galicia. Before turning to the historical importance of the camp, though, I want to begin with a story that I think poignantly addresses some of these issues. On June 8, 1942, Leon Wells stood in formation on the Appellplatz of the Janowska concentration camp. He was 16 years old, and here's the Appellplatz. And this photograph, which I'll refer to frequently, is actually a 1944 Luftwaffe aerial photograph taken of the camp in April. So it's a photograph taken while the camp was still in operation to a certain extent. And it's really an amazing resource that we really don't have for most of the concentration camps and ghettos of Eastern Europe. So in any case, Leon was 16 years old. He was feverish and racked with muscle pain, and he tried to follow his work brigade out of the camp. But as he described it, quote, "Limbs and brains no longer coordinate. I cannot move." End quote. The SS set him aside along in a space known as the Between Wire, with 179 other prisoners unable to work. And the Between Wire is located roughly right here. And I'll come back to that later. This was literally a liminal space between life and death, where those marked for murder would accumulate. The SS then marched this group into the sands outside the camp and forced Leon to remove his clothes and dig a pit along with the others. He was actually content. Leon had given up. He felt his life, quote, slip away piece by piece. And with each piece went some of his pain, end quote. When his turn to be shot arrived, a Ukrainian guard dragged him back to the camp to retrieve another corpse. Weakly, Leon began dragging the dead man behind him as he followed the guard back to the killing site. On the way back, however, he had an epiphany. He remembered, quote, "Suddenly, with lightning rapidity, all the impulses of life take hold of me again, and the thought of escaping flashes through my mind and becomes a living reality. I have nothing, absolutely nothing to lose, but everything to gain," end quote. So Leon drops the body, and he runs back into the camp, where he hides among the prisoners returning from work. The Ukrainians shouted for him, and Leon kept moving away from the sound. Eventually, the guard gave up and returned to the killing site. Yet Leon was not safe yet. If he was discovered missing, his parents, brothers, and sisters who still lived in Lviv would be shot in reprisal. And this is one of the interesting facets of the camp, was the deep connection between the camp, which is at the end of the streetcar line, and the city itself and the ghetto. Family members were within reach of the Nazis. Therefore, he hid in his workshop until evening roll call, where, fortunately, he was reported dead. And this means that the guard had evidently not been, or had been afraid to report his mistake, that he had let Leon escape. Therefore, as a prisoner who frequently worked outside the camp on SS homes, Leon simply walked out of the front gate and escaped to the countryside, where he went to live with his family in Lwów. However, after his family in the country were killed, Leon returned to Lviv to find his brothers, who were then living in the ghetto. Unfortunately, on June 1st, 1943, the SS arrived in force and arrested Leon along with his two brothers and thousands of others. This was likely part of the final liquidation of the ghetto in June of 1943, almost a year after his first arrest. Once again, Leon found himself in Janowska. A selection took place of all those selected in the ghetto. Leon's brother Jacob was shot trying to escape the selection, and his other brother Aaron was taken with 4,000 to 5,000 others, men, women, and children, to be shot in the sands behind the camp. This time in Janowska, Leon was assigned to the infamous Summit Commando 1005, a slave labor detail whose sole purpose was to excavate the bodies of those killed by the Nazis and burn them, crush any remaining bones to ashes, and rebury their remnants. Being small, Leon was assigned as an orderly to keep records. However, one day he was sent out with the rest to excavate a grave. The SS knew how many bodies to expect in each grave, and this one was to hold 181 bodies. They could only find 180 skulls. This is how they tracked how many bodies they were pulling out of each grave, was by the number of skulls. The commandos spent all day searching for the missing body, eventually giving up. The last body was, of course, Leon's. He had literally stood in his own grave for the second time. Because the guard had not reported him escaped, it was assumed that he had been shot along with the rest, and that's why the numbers were off. This would all be amazing enough, I think, as a story, particularly a story for a survivor of the Holocaust, except that Leon was part of the event that happened on November 19th, 1943, when the Summit Commando killed an SS guard, and approximately 50 of them escaped, including Leon, who was hidden along with 20 other Jews by a Polish farmer until the liberation in 1944, July. Wells would go on later to testify at the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, as well as the trial, the Stuttgart-Lemberg trial of many of the main perpetrators of the Holocaust in Lviv and in the Galicia region, and gave multiple testimonies and wrote 2 books, eventually emigrating to the United States, where he got a degree in engineering and worked as an engineer. So I begin with this extraordinary tale to illustrate in human terms the variety of phenomena associated with Janowska, its hybrid nature, its proximity and association with the Lviv ghetto, and the forms of Nazi policy playing out at a local level. Taken with hundreds of other survivor testimonies, perpetrator statements, photos, artwork, and maps, this obscure camp offers an incredible range of elements essential to understanding the Holocaust. Lviv had the 3rd largest Jewish population in Poland, 160,000, which swelled with refugees between 1939 and 1941. More Jews lived in Lviv than all of the Netherlands. And here's just a map showing, this is a period map of Lviv showing the location of Janowska, which should not be a surprise to most people. The camp itself was located at the last stop on the city streetcar line, and still is today. As a result, it was inextricably linked to the ghetto in Lviv, and most of its prisoners were locals. This would be important for all aspects of the camp. First, let me give a brief history of the camp itself and its establishment. Janowska began as the DAW Lemberg, the Deutsche Ausrüstungswerke, or German Equipment Factory. An SS Untersturmführer, 2nd Lieutenant, named Wolfgang Mowinckel, arrived from the DAW in Lublin to found the camp at 134 Janowska Street in the summer of 1941. 35-year-old SS Obersturmführer Fritz Gebauer and his wife arrived on 1 August 1941, and he became commandant of the camp in the beginning of November. And here we have a map drawn by Gebauer in the 1960s for the German authorities in the context of his trial of the Deutsche Ausrüstungswerke, or the DAW. And it's actually quite detailed, and if you look at it compared to the satellite or the aerial photograph, it's quite useful. It's also quite interesting. I always mention this part, because if you look over on this side, this is what will become the Zwangsarbeitslager Janowska, which is perhaps the more infamous portion of the camp. And you'll notice that he's just drawn question marks, as if he had no idea what was going on over there or what the buildings looked like. And so here we have literally a visual representation of a perpetrator trying to lie about what he knew about the Holocaust, in which he was deeply complicit. So when Gebauer got there, he inherited a large hall and several workshops, including fitting, turning, carpentry, plumbing, and electrical shops. and these were existing from a prior factory complex that was at the site. It was a small place with only around 100 workers, the majority of whom were Jewish. It measured approximately 40 acres. And you can compare that to 500 acres at Auschwitz, 40 acres at Treblinka, and 667 acres of Majdanek. But Gebauer sought to quickly remedy the diminutive size of his realm. According to survivor testimony, he appeared in the Jewish labor office in the ghetto and demanded 500 laborers, especially skilled laborers. These he received, including several trained engineers, to help him build and run his slave labor enterprise. Again, this highlights the importance of the Janowska camp in the context of Lviv, because the ghetto provided the labor, it provided the architects, and much of the skilled labor that allowed this particular camp to operate. He also received a Ukrainian guard force, some of whom were initially Travniki from all over Eastern Europe, who were later also augmented with local Ukrainians as well. And he received an adjutant, a man by the name of Gustav Vilhaus. 4 years Gebauer's junior, Vilhaus was a handsome man who arrived with his wife Liesel and their 4-year-old daughter, and they took up residence at a villa on the edge of the DAW. Vilhaus and his wife both enjoyed shooting prisoners from the balcony of their villa, while their daughter clapped and watched. However, all was not well between these two SS officers, and this spat was obvious even to prisoners in the camp. One survivor recalled that it was an open secret that Vilhaus and Gebauer could not stand each other. Gebauer himself remarked bitterly when questioned that, quote, Vilhaus was supposed to help me in the office, but he didn't. He got in contact with police leader Katzmann, and Katzmann was the higher SS and police leader for Lviv, immediately after his arrival, end quote. The goal of Vilhaus's politicking soon became clear as he was tasked directly by Katzmann with establishing his own camp directly next to the DAW. This would become known as the Zwangsarbeitslager Lemberg, or the Forced Labor Camp Lviv, or simply Janowska. And so when survivors and many people talk about the Janowska camp, they're very often talking about both of these camps together as one large camp. Technically speaking, they are two separate entities, which added an additional 21 acres to the overall complex. And here's an image of Vilhaus at the front gate, and it's a very famous image at the front gate of the camp during his time as commander. Gebauer again said, quote, I was supposed to supply him, Vilhaus, with materials, and no less than my own craftsmen, to build this camp. Because I desperately needed the material and craftsmen for my own production, I refused, even to Katzmann. As a result, there arose disagreements between Vilhaus and I. I also had to put up with incivility from Katzmann, end quote. In fact, what arose was a tense rivalry that doomed Gebauer to second-rate status because of Katzmann's patronage of Vilhaus. The nature of their relationship is best exemplified by Vilhaus's dachshund, which he named Fritz, after Gebauer. As one survivor remembered, Vilhaus took great pleasure in, quote, berating his dog with the worst curse words. And in a great sort of historical moment, we have this also very famous photograph of the Janowska Camp Orchestra. And if you notice, there's the dachshund right there, which is Vilhaus's dog, which he named Fritz after Gebauer, and then abused. To sort of give you an idea of the relationship between these guys, which had a direct effect in many ways on the prisoner experience in the camp. The Zwangsarbeitslager, or ZAL, under Vilhaus's demanding leadership grew large and was built entirely by Jewish slave labor, both skilled and unskilled. Much of this labor was poached from Gebauer, to his great frustration. And then later, Vilhaus's camp supplied laborers to a large number of civilian and military concerns in Lviv, as well as to the DAW itself. Its population numbered in the thousands, and the poor hygiene conditions and hard work led to a high mortality rate. Throughout the operation of the camp, prisoners were routinely shot to death in an area behind the camp known as the Piaski, Polish for the Sands, or the Valley of Death. It was no secret to the Jews of Lviv, and a common warning in the ghetto was, quote, "You'll end up in the dunes." And here you see both an enlargement of the aerial photographs showing some of the ravines behind the camp, which you can actually access today through the cemetery if you want to visit, as well as a photograph taken of an actual killing taking place in one of these ravines. Beginning in November of 1941, the Nazi authorities confined the Jewish population of Lviv to a ghetto in the northern, poorest area of the city. I should pause here to note that the actual confinement took a very long time to actually develop and went through various different stages. However, the plan sort of began to be developed in November of 1941. It wasn't realized at all until much later, into 1942. And here is a period German map of how they planned to move Jews from various regions in Lviv into this ghetto region, which is in the northern part of the city. The ghetto itself had an initial population of between 119,000 and 150,000 men, women, and children. Almost immediately, a series of actions began bringing large numbers of Jews to the Janowska camp. Often selections were carried out initially in the camp to replace laborers, and the remainder were loaded onto cars at the nearby Kleperov station for deportation to the extermination centers of Belzec and Sobibor. And here again, we talk a little bit about proximity and distance and location. As you can see here is the location of the Kleperov station in relationship to the Janowska camp, and then in a larger sense, the location of Lviv in comparison to the location of Belzec, which is not at all far away. Later, Belzec ceased operations in December of 1942. And after that point, Lviv Jews were murdered in the sands behind the camp, along with Jews from the region. Throughout this period of time, SS men rotated in and out of the camp, moving to other camps and other ghettos throughout the region. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. In the summer of 1943, in accordance with guidelines established throughout the East, a subunit of Summit Commando 1005 arrived in Lviv to destroy the evidence of Nazi crimes. And this is the unit that Leon was assigned to during his second stay in Janowska. It operated first in the camp, and later in the killing sites around the city, for example, the Lichiko Forest and other places, where, for example, thousands of Soviet POWs had been murdered. In November 1943, the camp was almost entirely liquidated. The few remaining prisoners were evacuated a few days before liberation in July 1944, and either sent to other camps farther west, or taken on death marches by SS personnel, who were now using the prisoners as an excuse not to fight at the front. So with this brief introduction to the camp's history, I want to focus on the hybrid nature of the place and its location in the larger Nazi genocidal project. I think that when laid out, these connections and the special nature of the camp strongly reinforce the need for dedicated work on this 60 acres. The DAW and the ZAL were established first to provide slave labor for German operations within the city. The camp also often took in new laborers from the surrounding region. Estimates vary, but by 1943 there were perhaps at least 8,000 prisoners. They were divided into brigades that routinely left the camp to work in a factory, or other sites in the city. However, not everyone left the camp. Leon Wells writes of a compulsion brigade, whose task was to carry stones they were clearly incapable of lifting. They were then beaten as punishment. Another survivor recalled that on Sundays, when German firms were closed, prisoners were ordered to take, quote, bundles of wire, bricks, or beams lying in the outside square and carry them to some other place, located 100 to 200 meters away, and when this was done, to carry all this back. And again the same, just to prevent us from relaxing and resting. End quote. Often the prisoners forced to do this were Schwarzarbeiters, or unskilled labor. Skilled laborers received somewhat preferential treatment. Here we can see an example of what some historians call annihilation through labor, a systematic attempt to kill Jews through work, frequently meaningless work with no concern for their welfare. The Janowska experience here then touches on a much larger debate among the SS themselves towards working Jews in general, whether all slave labor was intended to kill Jews, or whether they were intended to be kept alive for productive work until such a time as they could all be murdered. Yet most labor was not unproductive. Brigades marched out each day to work in jobs as varied as army motor pool units, clothing factories creating Wehrmacht uniforms, street cleaning details, and salvage brigades collecting scrap metal and cardboard to be recycled. And here we have an image of slave laborers breaking tombstones in the Jewish cemetery, just next door to the Ukrainian cemetery, just next door to the Janowska camp. And what's really interesting about this particular photograph is we have the Jews here breaking up Jewish tombstones, and we can also see the German company that was involved in salvaging these stones. So it gives you a really nice insight into all of these connections in one photograph. This is an image from a man that I draw on frequently named Zev Porath. Zev Porath, very briefly, was a former architect from Lviv who was interned in the camp and was employed in the drafting office in the headquarters building of the camp. And his job was to help plan and build, draw the plans for various buildings in the camp. When he was not doing that, he was creating his own drawings of the camp, which he then managed to smuggle out when he escaped himself. And so with him we have an incredible array of drawings, some of which are very, very objective and factual, that show us what the camp looked like when it was in operation. In other words, these are not drawn years after the fact. Many of these were drawn as he was sitting at his desk in the headquarters building. And so here we see a labor brigade getting ready to leave the camp, along with the foreman of the labor brigade reporting to the SS. And what's really interesting also about this photograph is you'll see that Porath has cut away a building here so that you can actually see the people. So he's mixing perspectives to give us this very sort of accurate drawing of the space. This is not to say that the labor that was performed in the camp was not brutal or deadly. Almost every survivor recalled what the prisoners were called vitamin work, or Vitaminarbeit. Often brigades at work outside the camp returned in the evening after 12 hours of labor, only to be directed to the Klepperhof station to unload building materials from train cars. Most often these materials consisted of beams, bricks, or wooden boards, whose names in Polish began with B, C, and D, respectively, hence the name vitamin work. The survivors, or the prisoners, then had to run with these loads back to the camp. And if you go to Klepperhof today and you walk back to the camp, you can see how far that is if you're running, carrying a load of bricks or wood or whatnot, while being beaten and often killed. A survivor recalled that this work was especially feared as there were always, quote, tragic incidents. SS men like Peter Blum, who's pictured up here with his mugshot, beat prisoners who are already weakened by disease, who could not run fast enough under the heavy load. Blum then shot many workers to death. And this is a routine occurrence. Many other guards did the same thing. And of course, the proximity of the station to the camp is what made this possible in the first place. Not all Nazi authorities, however, appreciated this level of brutality. For example, the military commander of the general government wrote to the general staff in September of 1942 that, quote, the evacuation of the Jews, and by this he means their murder, without advance notice to most sections of the Wehrmacht has caused great difficulties in the replacement of labor and delay in correct production for military purposes. It is requested that the evacuation of Jews employed in industrial enterprises be postponed until this has been done. End quote. Heinrich Himmler, grudgingly agreed allowing small numbers of vital Jewish workers to remain in specific camps, but reminded the general that, quote, there too, in accordance with the wish of the Fuhrer, the Jews are someday to disappear, end quote. At the local level, too, in Lviv, there were businesses that allowed Jews to remain on company property on Sundays to protect them from SS abuse. And so we can see the complexity of Nazi labor policy playing out at different scales. And now I'm going to shift to a slightly different topic here. The Belzec Extermination Center, which I mentioned earlier, commenced operations in March of 1942. Jews from Lviv were among its first victims, traveling the 54 miles to the camp by train. This group was likely selected during an action in March known as the Asocial Action, in which 15,000 elderly, the sick, and other non-workers were deported from the ghetto. And here we have an image of Lwów Jews being deported to Janowska camp via streetcar. And I guess this would be the number 7 line, which my students and I took today out to the camp itself. In any case, this did not go without notice. As far away as Warsaw, the underground newspaper Nowy Tory reported in April that, quote, in the middle of March, 2 transports left with 13,500 people. Their fate arouses greatest anxiety, end quote. Of course, others knew exactly what that fate was. SS officer Kurt Gerstein was investigating the potential use of Zyklon B at the Reinhard camps and observed the gassing of these Jews from Lviv. He noticed a train carrying 6,700 Jews, of whom 1,450 were dead on arrival. He then witnessed the extermination process from start to finish and later attempted to pass information on to the Vatican. The beginning of mass deportations to Belzec and also Sobibor ushered in a new role for the Janowska camp, that of transit camp. As selections were carried out in the nearby ghetto, Lviv Jews were sent to Janowska. Survivor Samuel Drix recalled selections and deportations, writing, quote, women, irrespective of their health, appearance, or profession, children, and men over 45 were automatically sent to Belzec, end quote. Often they had to wait in the camp for trains to arrive at the Klepperov station, their point of departure for Belzec. Commandant Vilhaus took advantage of these transports to divest himself of unwanted prisoners. Drix continues, quote, Vilhaus simultaneously performed selection procedures in the camp every few weeks and joined those whom he had selected with those transported to Belzec. One of the most striking depictions of Janowska as a transit camp comes from Rudolf Raeder, one of only 2 survivors of Belzec. He wrote, quote, we were packed densely inside a tram where it was impossible to move or breathe and taken to the Janowska camp. It was evening. We were kept in a closed ring on a big lawn. There were 6,000 of us. We were ordered to sit, forbidden to get up, to smoke. We were illuminated by a searchlight from a tower. It was bright as day. Surrounded by armed beasts, we were sitting tightly squeezed, young and old, women and children of all ages. There were some shots. Somebody got up, maybe he wanted to be killed. We sat during the whole night in deathly silence. Neither children nor women cried. At 6 o'clock in the morning, we were ordered to get up from the wet grass, and a long column of the doomed marched to the Kleparov railway station." End quote. Nor were the new arrivals limited to Lviv Jews. Janowska collected Jews from smaller area towns. Survivor Adolf Folkman was sent by train from Tarnopol to Lwów, where he was briefly interned in Janowska before being sent on to Belzec. When the entire city workshop factory was liquidated, the Germans took the victims from the ghetto first to Janowska, where a small number of laborers were selected out, and the remainder sent on to the gas chambers. Thus, its transit status served both the camp itself and the Holocaust in general. In addition to moving people, Janowska was also deeply involved in the expropriation of Jewish property. One clear example of this was clothing. And here we have an image of prisoner effects that were just lying around the camp. This is taken after the liberation. It gives you an idea of the way that Jewish belongings were collected. As I said, one clear example was clothing. This is the best example. The camp tailor and laundry shop were kept busy with the clothes of the murdered, often sent back from Belzec itself. Under the watchful eyes of Peter Blum, who we already met, female prisoners sorted and mended this material. Other clothing came from liquidated ghettos in the area. Finally, when it became clear that many Jews, nicknamed parachutists, were jumping from the death trains and escaping, Nazi policy became that Jews were shipped from Lviv in only their underclothing. So their clothes were taken off here and then sent directly to the camp for cleaning and to be used again. Most of these clothes ended up in Blum's tailor shop. And again, if we look at the aerial photograph of the camp itself, we know based on survivor testimony and Zev Porat's maps and others where these places are, and you can see the location of the tailor shop as well as two of the clothing warehouses themselves. As I mentioned, Janowska owed much of its role as a transit camp to its proximity to Lviv and to important rail connections. However, in some ways, the way it functioned as such was different. Most transit camps functioned solely as such, and were geographically distant from the destinations of their prisoners. It is intriguing that mass deportations from the Lviv ghetto often stopped first in Janowska, even though the ghetto was less than 2 miles away. Perhaps this allowed the Nazis to better control the large numbers of victims, particularly during the August Action, where around 50,000 were deported. It's also known as the Great Action. Smaller groups could be confined at Janowska and then deported from the Kleparov station, rather than the more visible main station. Another important way in which the camp was connected to the formal extermination process was as the repository for the property of the murdered. Thus we see that Janowska was actually quite well integrated into the formal extermination process as a dedicated staging area and transit camp, while simultaneously performing its other tasks. The last and most perhaps vital role that Janowska played as a hybrid camp was serving as what I think I can legitimately call a dedicated extermination site. Certainly executions took place at other camps, but not with regularity or magnitude as they did at Janowska. Conversely, throughout the occupied East, there were sites of mass execution, of which Babi Yar in Kiev is perhaps the best example. However, these sites were graves only and had no permanent camp presence. Janowska, on the other hand, distinguished itself as a site of horrific killing and even exported its killers elsewhere in the city and in the surrounding region. Some of the killing in Janowska resembles that of other camps. Often mornings began with routine selections, with death runs, where prisoners ran a gauntlet of SS men while being beaten with crops, clubs, and rifle butts. Those who fell or were injured were placed in that liminal space known as the behind wire, until there were enough people to justify a trip to the sands. And here I want to again highlight an image I showed earlier. This is the Zev Porath drawing, but he's also actually drawn the behind wire right here. And you can see two sets of wire which actually extend out in this area, and he's also drawn individuals waiting here, some dead, some alive, in the behind wire, in the between wire, waiting to be killed. Of course, it goes without saying that anyone who became sick or simply exhausted was placed here as well. One survivor described the true meaning of this small place, saying, quote, "Sometimes they stayed behind wire for hours or even days, lying in cold and hunger, in winter on snow and freezing, waiting for their execution." End quote. Another survivor remembered that, quote, "In other cases, people were placed between the wires in order to spare bullets, and if they didn't freeze, it could take up to 3 days for them to die of hunger and exhaustion." End quote. Throughout its existence, the Janowska camp also served as a dedicated execution site. Actually, multiple sites. There was a set of gallows and a shooting area behind the kitchen, and another small ravine near the camp that were repeatedly used. And more significantly, for larger killings, the sandy hills overlooking the camp with their draws and ravines were employed as thousands were shot. And here you can see just some of the areas of the terrain of the camp that were used as killing sites. And then the red highlighted area was a large open space used for very large killings where individuals were stripped of their clothing and valuables and then divided into groups to be taken off to be shot. There were at least 11 separate identifiable actions targeting the Jewish population of Lviv. While many of these victims were deported to Belzec by train, executions of thousands of people continued unabated in the camp. In December 1942, as I mentioned, Belzec ceased killing operations, and Janowska became the main site of execution, not just for Lviv, but for this entire region of Galicia. Victims disrobed in an assembly area behind the women's barracks and marched to pits in the sands and were shot. Shootings varied in size, but increased beginning in January to take up the slack left by Belzec's absence. On January 22nd, 1943, the last Jewish council was shot in Janowska. On May 7th, 80 women working for the German railway were driven to Piaski and shot. At the end of May, 300 workers were selected in the camp and executed in the ravines behind it. Survivor Edmund Seidel recalled a transport arriving at the Klepperhof station. Everyone was shot, including 80 children. Some victims came from even farther afield. In November 1942, a truck carrying 40 French prisoners of war from Stalag 328 in Lviv, in the citadel, arrived in the camp, and all were shot in Piaski. And again, here is an enlargement of the image of Piaski that I showed earlier. And Piaski is, of course, at multiple places, not just this one location. Another group of victims was Jews caught hiding or passing outside the ghetto. These individuals were continually brought from the SS and Gestapo jails like Brigidki and Svartkov in Lviv to the camp. They were kept in awful conditions in several small cells in the main gatehouse. If you remember that original picture of Vilhaus, there were these two blocks. Those were very small cells in which prisoners were kept. They were also taken out to the sands and shot. A survivor wrote that, quote, "New people were brought every day out of the prisons and ghetto. They were abused in terrible ways. Jews arrested with false Aryan papers met the same fate. One didn't even make the effort to drive them to Piaski. They simply left them behind in the assembly area for many hours, sometimes 2 to 3 days, freezing and starving. They were later shot on the spot." And here we have another one of Zev Porath's sketches of an execution taking place inside the camp. And it's interesting on both a sort of abstract level, but also, again, you see the terrain, the hills, the ravines behind the camp, the watchtowers, and an SS man here abusing someone, and in the background, groups of people who have been shot and are waiting to be shot. When the remnants of the ghetto were liquidated, they were killed at Janowska. These executions lasted for weeks, with thousands being murdered. Survivor Saul Finkelstein described the scene, quote, "In June 1943, as the ghetto was liquidated, thousands of people were rounded up on the large assembly area near the Piaski. As we came there on this very hot day, we saw how the newly arrived Jews were ordered by the SS to crawl on the ground. The SS men enjoyed themselves by walking on us." End quote. And here, again, thanks to Zev, we have another image of the camp, part of which shows, again, here's, this is the main gate, and then here is the assembly area for this large group of Jews arriving from the ghetto. From the beginning of 1943, Janowska's role as an extermination site increased in scope, but not in nature. According to Himmler's order of July 1942, the extermination of Jews in the general government was to be completed by the end of the year. While this might not have been true at the macro level, there were large populations of Jews in camps and ghettos that had not been killed. In 1943, Janowska played an important role in this. Work brigades from the camp began to be marched not to work, but to the sands and executed. 1,600 workers from an ammunition factory were brought from the ghetto and shot. Other workers from the city and ghetto were also murdered. Meanwhile, trucks from the prisons downtown continued to roll. Janowska's reach as a killing site was not limited to Lviv, however. As ghettos and slave labor camps in the region began to be liquidated, many of their inhabitants were deported to Janowska to be killed. And here's a map that I made showing some of the places where prisoners came from to Janowska. And the numbers in blue are the distance in kilometers. Some examples. Between April and May 1943, a large transport of Jews from Brody, 64 miles away, arrived and were shot in the sands. In July or August 1943, 300 Jews from Proskorov arrived and were shot. Thus, not unlike Belzec, which it was in some ways replacing, Janowska became a central killing site. In addition, and I think this is a really important point to make about Janowska, personnel from this camp spread out across the region, commanding camps and ghettos, and eventually presiding over their liquidations. And so here we have a chart, and this is an incomplete chart, which is only a partial depiction of the other sites administered by personnel who had served or would serve at Janowska. So in other words, you have SS men who serve at Janowska and then move out to Złotów, Zborov, Yaktorov, Viniki, all these different places to eventually behave the same way they behaved at Janowska. And then once these places were liquidated, many of these men then returned back to Janowska to serve as guards in the camp. In addition, staff from the camp would frequently augment the killing squads of SD and Gestapo sent from Lviv to area camps and ghettos. For example, SS man Roman Schönbach, who is a very infamous guard, moved as commander of the guard force at Janowska, which is his first job, to the same position in Drohobych. In the fall of 1943, he participated in the liquidation of the labor camp there. Karl Kempke served in 2 slave labor camps in the region before coming to Janowska after their liquidation. From March to April 1943, the hated Adolf Kalanko from Janowska commanded the Grodek labor camp until most of its prisoners were shot to death in a house in the camp. Kalanko was assisted by multiple SS men from Janowska and then returned to the camp. In one final way, the Zwangsarbeitslager Janowska both mirrored and differed from the Reinhardt camps. In June 1942, Heinrich Müller, the chief of the Gestapo, appointed former Einsatzgruppen commander Paul Blobel to command a special collection of units known as the Summit Commando 1005. These groups were tasked with the destruction of the evidence of Nazi killing in the East. Bodies were first burned in the camps before the units moved on to other Einsatzgruppen killing sites. Lviv was assigned a unit commanded by Walter Scharlach. Based in Janowska, it began the gruesome task of exhuming bodies, burning them, crushing the bones remaining, and sifting the ashes for valuables. And this is a famous photograph taken after the war, after liberation, of the bone grinder used in the camp to grind up the bones remaining after burning the bodies, along with former members of Summit Commando 1005 Jews who were survivors and gave testimony to the Soviets. Leon Wells, of course, belonged to this death brigade. However, unlike most Summit Commandos, whose sole task was disposal, in Janowska, executions and exhumations occurred simultaneously. As one former member of Summit Commando 1005 reported, the commando under Scharlach was absolutely not just a so-called exhumation group, but rather this group carried out executions to a large extent. End quote. Often the prisoner detail was kept in their tents during large executions until ordered to come out and bury the bodies. The camp at Janowska was further involved in other elements of the Nazi genocidal project when the Summit Commando 1005 was moved across the city to the Lichakowski forest. There the detail began unearthing a second series of large mass graves there. These graves contained Polish professors and intellectuals murdered in 1941 and identified by their possessions. They also contained Soviet and Italian prisoners of war murdered there before and during the presence of Summit Commando 1005. One death brigade prisoner estimated that there were 45 mass graves containing 500 to 800 bodies each. That works out to approximately 22.5 to 36,000 victims just at that site in the Lichakowski forest. Leon Wells and 50 other members of the death brigade escaped from that camp, from that site, on November 19th, 1943. Thus, Janowska was by any standard a deadly place. The death rate among simple workers was high to begin with, but the camp also functioned as a dedicated killing space, almost from its inception, though its victims varied in nature and number over time. Its importance as an extermination site has certainly been overlooked by most of the scholarship. However, one scholar has already written, quote, "Although there were no gas chambers in Janowska, it is likely that more people were murdered there, mostly by shooting, than at Majdanek." End quote. And Majdanek is currently described by many as an extermination center, with a death toll of approximately 60,000 Jews and 20,000 non-Jews. The number murdered at Janowska, as I mentioned, likely exceeds this number. Not to mention the complicity of the camp in the deportation of the Jews of Lviv to the killing centers in the area. Of the 160 to 200,000 Jews in Lviv in 1941, survivor groups accounted for approximately 3,400 Jews in September 1944, 97% of whom were working-age male adults. Today, Janowska is barely commemorated. Much of the terrain of the camp is still a prison, Penal Colony 30. Holocaust remembrance in Lviv is certainly a work in progress, led not least by this very center in the work it's doing, part of which is actually allowing me to speak here. However, the Ghetto Memorial and other Holocaust sites have been recently vandalized. In short, the future of these sites is very uncertain. And here we see a Google image aerial satellite photograph of the Penal Colony 30, which is here, and what is left of the terrain of the DAW here. And having gone through this neighborhood, some of the buildings may likely date back to the period of the camp, but many others are new construction from the Soviet period. The hills back here provide an excellent overview of the camp, part of which you can see here. And if you look at the outlines of the camp, of the prison today, and you compare them to the outlines of the actual Janowska camp, you'll notice that they are almost identical. So what can we conclude from the discussion of the Janowska camp and its split personality? I think we have to recognize first that an in-depth study of the camp is overdue and important, but much more important than justifying future research are the implications that such a study could have for understanding the complexity of the camp system and its place in the Nazi genocidal project. In Janowska and in the Lviv experience, we have almost all the important elements of the Holocaust, some of which I did not have time to talk about here. We see the interplay between differing SS views of labor, the role of this local space in deportations and the final solution, local collaboration, many forms of Jewish resistance, expropriation of Jewish property, the connections between the camp and ghetto, and the mass murder of Soviet and Italian prisoners of war, not to mention all of the post-war issues of memory and memorialization throughout the Soviet period into the Ukrainian independent period up to the present. We also see at the local level the outlines of an important network of perpetrators that passed in and out of Janowska as they went on to manage other camps and ghettos and then returned to the camp. It is apt that one survivor called the camp itself, quote, a school of atrocities, end quote. Members of the Summit Commando 1005 recall demonstrations of the destruction process for other SS men from other 1005 detachments who came here for a 10-day course on how to carry out the exhumation and burning of corpses throughout the region and throughout the occupied Soviet Union. So that literally was a school for learning how to conduct these awful activities. So viewing the camp in its local, regional, and transnational context also challenges us to recognize and explain the flexibility and hybrid nature of the camp itself, and to look for similar places. Was this a common phenomenon, or something new? If new, why? In any case, these are questions that, along with my research assistants, I'm hoping to answer as we move forward. I certainly don't claim to have all the answers. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I very, very much look forward to your questions. So thank you very much.
Дякуємо за цю лекцію, дякуємо.
Thank you for this lecture, and thank you for the materials that you presented, because they help us have better understanding of what Janowska camp was really about, and also they offer a lot of food for thought and provoke many questions, I suppose. Therefore, I encourage the audience to ask their questions. Just raise your hands and you'll get the microphone.
Do you have any information on what happened with the commandants, especially the husband and wife and daughter that you mentioned, the Vilhauses? What's sort of information on their fate? I mean, what happened, and other people, and how many were charged or convicted, and all of that?
Yeah, this is a... I'll wait a little bit. This is a fantastic question. So, so Vilhaus actually, believe it or not, requests a transfer from the camp to the front, and he receives it. Now, there's an interesting story that at least several survivors have put forward. And I only mention the story because it makes me feel good. I have no evidence beyond these survivor statements that this is true, but it could be true. In any case, the story is this. A couple, and at least two survivors have mentioned it. The story is that some of the camp underground stole Vilhaus's personal stationery. And on it, they wrote a request for a transfer to the Eastern Front, and then sent it off to the SS headquarters in Berlin. And you can imagine, of course, if this is true, Vilhaus, receives his transfer orders, and there's no way that he can say no, right? Because he requested it theoretically. Again, I have zero evidence that is true, except that he was actually transferred to the front, which is not something that someone in his position would normally do. I mean, he had a pretty good job. He lived in a nice villa. He had no risk of being hurt. But in any case, he does end up fighting, and he dies in East Prussia at a place called Steinfischbach, where he's buried in a mass grave. So Vilhaus dies. Gustav dies. His wife survives and flees back to Germany. She remarries to a guy named Hansberg. She runs a gambling establishment with slot machines in Germany, and she is arrested several times for cheating her customers. And then she is questioned about her role in the camp, and she is, I believe, even brought to the major trial, but is not convicted of anything. So that's sort of the way the Vilhauses end up. Gebauer does survive the war and is brought to trial. There's a very, very large trial called the Lemberg Prozess in, I believe, 66-67 in Stuttgart. It is the second largest trial in post-war German history, other than the Auschwitz process, and it covers the guard force from the Janowska camp. It covers the SS and Gestapo leaders of the city. It covers the Nazi civilian leaders of the city, people like Weber, who was the head of the labor office, and other folks. Most of the guards are convicted of something. They don't receive the death sentence. Most of them don't even receive life. I'd have to go through individually, but sentences of between 5 and 7 years are not uncommon. And then you have certain individuals who claim that they are too sick to be tried. This is what John Demjanjuk claimed, and this is not an uncommon phenomenon, and so they end up not being tried for this. But there is a trial, and unlike a lot of places, in fact, large numbers of folks are actually brought to trial for this. And then there are other separate trials, smaller trials in Germany for people from different camps and locations who are not tried at Stuttgart.
Yes, it's important because I want to ask you in Ukrainian.
Okay, great.
I have several questions, in fact. The first question is about your sources. Yes, of course, it could take another lecture, but I'm just interested to know about the main sources, their availability and accessibility. Have they been destroyed or not? Maybe there are some lacunas that will never be possible to research. And there is another question. I'm not the expert, but I believe this is the least researched campsite. Why so? Because obviously in the Soviet times it was not possible, but the 27 years of Ukraine's independence was quite enough to have at least several publications or analysis or explorations on that. The second question, about your statement about the hybrid nature of the camp. Please get a pen, yes. The question about the hybrid nature of the camp. We have faced this issue when we jointly worked with the colleagues over the program, because we were not sure which term is most appropriate. Therefore, this hybrid nature and the multifaceted nature of the camp, which name would you suggest, therefore? And the third question, we now have several commemorative sites, like we have this Territory of Terror Museum. When it was being built, there were some discussions about the entrance to this museum, about the entrance that looks like the reproduction of the main gate from the Janowska camp. There have been different opinions, both supporting and favor and not in favor of using this reproduction. What do you think about this?
Okay, great. Those are some fantastic questions to sort of cover a lot of different things. So as far as sources go, it is surprising that it hasn't been studied, given that there are a lot of sources, and I'll just go through some of them. You know, one of the ones that led me to become so interested in this was the fact that we have those aerial photographs, and we could literally start to see on the ground, you know, where these places are, right? There are huge amounts of trial testimonies, and in this I mean pre-trial interrogations of individuals in the camp. So we have Gebauer. Gebauer is interrogated 8 times, along with Kolonko and many of the other SS men at the camp. Liesel, Vilhaus, is interrogated. Varzak, who is the second commandant of the camp, he and his wife are both interrogated and questioned. And these are sources, obviously, that have problems, right? You know, there are certain times and at certain points in their testimony when they are inclined to lie. But there are lots of places where they're not. And so that's one great source. Secondly, the numbers of survivor testimonies are incredible. They're surprisingly large, how many of them there are. And these come from all over. And they, thanks to the trials in which these take place, I therefore have access to Hebrew, Ukrainian, Russian, Yiddish, German, French, all kinds of different languages in which these are translated. And because I'm not doing a literary analysis, you know, of anything, the translation piece is not really an obstacle. We have not just Zeb Porath's drawings, we have at least one other person that did drawings of the camp. And Zeb Porath's drawings, if you compare them to the actual camp itself, are very, very accurate. So those are useful. We have oral testimonies, video testimonies from the USC Shoah Foundation. So video testimonies of survivors talking about the camp, which are very, very useful. We have some, and this is one of the lacuna that you were talking about, in terms of German sources.
And some camp documentation. Yeah,
camp documentation. So there's very little camp documentation, if any, because it's such a small place, and it's most likely that most of that stuff was destroyed. So we don't have the kind of documentation we might have at an Auschwitz. You know, what we do have are things that were sent someplace else, and we have copies of them that were sent someplace else. Here in the archives at Dalo, we have some documents of people requesting slave laborers from the camp, you know, various factories in the city requesting slave laborers. But that is sort of a blank area to a certain extent, because we don't have sort of daily memos, which is why, and I'm sure someone has this question already, you know, determining the exact numbers, even of people in the camp, let alone people killed, can be somewhat difficult, because we don't have, you know, prisoner registration rolls, even though prisoners were registered. We don't have those kinds of sources. However, we do have a really astounding number and diversity of sources, which I think makes a lot of this possible. even in the absence of camp documents. Your second question was, sort of why did it take so long to get here, to get to studying this place? And I think there are a couple answers, and I'm sure many of you probably have some good answers as well from the Ukrainian perspective. From sort of the larger scholarly perspective, as you mentioned, up until the fall of the Soviet Union, there wasn't a lot of focus on the Holocaust in the Soviet Union itself, with the exception of sort of Auschwitz and Majdanek and some of the major places, for several reasons. One being that you didn't have a lot of survivors from these smaller places. This includes Einsatzgruppen shootings. Secondly, the West was not particularly interested in hearing about Soviet suffering, because the Soviet policy of do not divide the dead obscured the Jewish nature of the Holocaust in the first place. Obviously, the archives and whatever archival materials the Soviets had accumulated was not accessible. And so there was a lot of focus on camps in Germany and the experience of Western Europe, which we know is not representative of the Holocaust. The fact that there were more Jews in Lviv than in all of the Netherlands, or more Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto than in all of France, tells us that the Holocaust is first and foremost an Eastern European experience. And even that revelation is a relatively recent, in the last 20-some years of Holocaust scholarship, where scholars have begun to turn to Eastern Europe and really focus not only on these main places like the Warsaw Ghetto or like Auschwitz, but also on these much smaller places, to include the killing sites. So I think that's part of it. I think Janowska, in a certain sense, gets lost in the noise of Eastern European, of Holocaust in Eastern Europe, because there are lots of other places that have been focused on first. Babi Yar, Kaunas, Lithuania, these kind of things. I guess, and now I'm speculating a little bit, if we look at it from the post-independence period, there's a tension here, I think, with recognizing the Holocaust, commemorating the Holocaust, commemorating Jewish suffering in Ukraine for some people. If we're talking about sort of the Banderistas and people that support that version of history, that version of the history of the war, where the OUN is this sort of heroic organization. Anything that begins to highlight the Holocaust and potentially any Ukrainian collaboration in the Holocaust may open wounds that are uncomfortable, I think, for some people in Ukraine, and particularly perhaps for people in positions of authority that are most able to drive this kind of commemoration. I mean, I should note, obviously, that there were thousands of Ukrainians that helped Jews and rescued Jews and saved Jews. So this isn't a question of sort of, piling on Ukrainians as collaborators. I mean, there were Poles that were collaborators and Belarusians and everybody else. And I think that there's a similar phenomenon that goes on in places like Lithuania and Belarus and other Eastern European countries, where collaboration is a difficult topic to deal with, because certainly, for example, Ukrainians, many Ukrainians were victims, very real victims of both the Nazis and the Soviets. The Nazis and Soviets murdered innocent Ukrainians, right? This is true. However, it's very difficult to commemorate one without recognizing the other, because if you commemorate the victimhood of non-Jewish Ukrainians without commemorating the victimhood of Jewish Ukrainians, it then appears to many people that you're trying to sort of obscure this behavior. And I suspect that is a reason why Janowska has remained sort of on the edges of this, along with things like the Golden Rose, which is only very recently has been very nicely, by the way, commemorated, and how Jewish history here is actually being very well commemorated. I can say, compared to other places in Eastern Europe, Lviv is doing, I think, a good job and is at least moving in the direction of good commemoration. But it's difficult because, we still have people living who were alive during that time. And this is a phenomenon true in Germany as well, but you start asking questions of grandparents. What did you do during the war? What did you know during the war? It starts to become an uncomfortable subject for some people. I think that filters up to the support for scholars working in these areas, perhaps. And that is partially just a supposition on my part, and I could be wrong, and people here could have some insight on that. That would be fantastic. Your third question of sort of regarding the hybrid nature of the camp and what should we call it, right? I would stick with the concentration camp because I reserve Extermination Center for the Reinhard camps, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, and Auschwitz and Chelmno. And then Majdanek is on its way out, I think, in Holocaust scholarship in terms of as an extermination center, pure and simple. And I would stick with concentration camp because I talked about those 40,000. There are, even in that 40,000, there are factory camps. The Durchgangsstrasse 4 camps, for example, here in Galicia, are mobile. Like they move every couple of months as they're building that road. And so what do you call them, right? And so this is a dilemma that not just you're having, but the Holocaust Encyclopedia and the Holocaust Museum in DC is having. What do we call these places? There's so many of these places and they're so different. So I think that that slave labor camp also fits. I use slave labor, not forced labor, because these people were literally sold to various factories and that kind of thing. So I would, I guess, in lack of a better word, stick with concentration camp, or perhaps, I'm not necessarily sure I'm in the position to coin a new term, but a hybrid camp could become a term if we find that that's a phenomenon that is supported elsewhere and is something that is useful to us. As far as your comment about the gate at the museum, I haven't seen it yet. I'm going to go visit, I think maybe tomorrow. I was the director of a Holocaust museum in the United States for a while, and before I took over, that museum had a gas chamber in it, a reconstructed gas chamber. And one of the first things that I did was get rid of that. I literally have a picture of me with a hammer, like tearing down the walls of that, because I felt like anything that is that lends itself towards an experiential sort of theme park kind of experience is not useful, right? We don't want our readers or our visitors to come away from a book or a movie or a museum or a commemorative site thinking they know what it was like to be there, because we are fundamentally incapable of getting someone to that level, I think. So my first take on that, obviously not having seen it and not knowing all the discussions behind it, is that that's probably not something that fulfills the purpose that the people who, and probably in good faith, created it wanted to fulfill, I guess is the way that I would answer that question.
Okay, so English. So I will a little bit follow up on one of the previous questions and take it to a larger topic of not only how to qualify this one specific camp, but actually how do we work with terminology, categories, and language that was used by Nazi authority and in the discourse of the final solution to describe and to bring in the perspective of victims. like beginning from what it was for those who've been there, not who were perpetrators, to even the question of identity, because yes, you're saying Jews, but this is only one part of their identity, and it's very hard to say who was Ziv Porat. Was he an architect? Was he a Jewish inmate, Jews, male? So actually, what in your research, how to get to take into account the language of sources, but also get out, especially German sources, and the language that is there. The second question is one of your last images is this view towards Janowska campsite today, which is a place which is very much off our view, partly because it's a prison, secondly because you drive through, and thirdly very few people would walk that path up to the hill to have a look. It's a very, it's an excluded site, and it's a dark site in terms of past, but also in terms of present. It's a prison. It's a question, one issue is, how we make it visible, and, maybe also some of your suggestion, what you think in terms of what could be there. Would be interesting and helpful, but another question about visibility is not about now, but about the time that you are researching during the existence of the camp. Because you mentioned many times about mobility, about moving people, about what you also were talking when discussing the project Fully Interactive. You showed us how Janowska concentration camp is at the center of Holocaust in Galicia and broadly, but how to tell the story of Janowska as a part of city history. How to bring it back or bring it in, because it is not only a story of Holocaust, it's also a story of occupation and of the city in general. And so the question is how to frame, are there ways to frame the history of Janowska, and what are the sources? For example, what in accounts or testimonies that are non-Jewish does it feature? How it feature? Is it mentioned? How can we figure out how it was known, perceived during the time?
Thank you very much, Sophia. These are some great questions and some challenging ones, I must say. Let me start with the last question first, in terms of non-Jewish, I guess also non-German sources, right? And so that's a legitimate, I think, critique of the work that I'm doing, which is that there don't seem to be a large number. I mean, I don't speak Ukrainian, but that doesn't seem to be the issue here. It's not that I know that there are all these books in Ukrainian about this, and I just don't have access to them. It doesn't seem like there are a lot of sort of ego documents by Ukrainians or by Poles, during this period to work with. And I think, so part of that has to do with this very difficult task of where do bystanders appear in the historical record, right? Because their very nature as bystanders means that they don't really appear, because they're just sort of there, even if they're collaborators, right? The collaborators appear in documents a little more, so there is work on Ukrainian police and Ukrainian militia, and you can find the records of the various precincts during roundups, and like how many Jews they rounded up and how many bullets they fired and that kind of thing. And so those documents do exist, and they lend a certain aspect to this. There are documents about Ukrainian police who desert, Ukrainian militia who desert, Ukrainian guards who desert, and that gives you some idea of who they are biographically, right? The same thing exists with some of the Travniki men. But again, it doesn't really tell you, per se, so much about what they think. We have some very famous ego documents, like from the Metropolitan Jeptinsky, which is also can be a problematic source, but he does make pronouncements about what he thinks about going on, and he does save at least some Jews. But he's obviously not representative of your average person on the street. My sense is, and again, I recognize this is a critique of my own work, is that the best route to this is through a project of oral history here in Lviv, of interviewing people who are still alive, if possible, collecting diaries, these kinds of things, because that's where you're going to find, I think, the local, be it Ukrainian, be it Polish, view of the Holocaust. One of the weaknesses, if you will, of using trial documentation can be that the questions are specific questions related to what the trial is based on. They're not necessarily questions about what was it like during the war. Though a lot of the survivor testimonies include those long, particularly the oral testimonies. Like Leon Walls' testimony starts, he's born in Stoyanov, and goes all the way to, where he is now with his grandkids. And he gives his impression of Ukrainians, and it's not a one-sided impression. It's a very complex one. And so I think that is one way to get at it, but you have to recognize, of course, that it is coming from the perspective of survivors. Another source of sort of Ukrainian or Polish information that's somewhat useful are the American denaturalization trial documents. So people like Demyanyuk and others who are deported, there's an investigation into them by the Office of Special Investigation with the State Department, and some of that information, their backstory, their history, comes out in that. There's a guy named Ivan Kaliman. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that name, but he was Kalimanov. Yeah, he was in Lviv. He was a militiaman, policeman, and he was deported because the United States found in documents that he had reported that he had shot 5 people because he had to account for his bullets. And so he said, I expended 5 bullets shooting at Jews. And that then qualified him for deportation. And so in those documents, there's a certain amount of biographical data. But as I said, I think, and certainly there are people that can correct me on this if I'm wrong. If there are useful diaries or other kinds of documents out there, that would be what I would look for. But my sense is, I haven't had anyone yet tell me, hey, Waitman, you're missing this whole body of literature in Ukrainian or in Russian that talks about these things from that perspective. And so trying to get at the Ukrainian or Polish experience has to be done via reading survivor sources very carefully. I guess that's not a satisfactory answer, but it's the one that I have. Visibility, let me again go with the second to last first. So visibility during the war, I think, is a really important and interesting topic. As I mentioned, the streetcars are used for deportation, so obviously everyone in Lviv is watching the streetcars go by, and they know where they're going. I mean, Janowska is not a secret. It's too close to be a secret. Everyone, if you do have instances of non-Jews living in Lviv, even Germans who aren't involved in the killing process that are working in Lviv, they all smell the bodies burning. They sometimes hear the shots being fired. I mean, this is not a secret place by any stretch of the imagination. And locals are watching these work brigades going back and forth to work. They're owning the factories, or they're working beside them in the factories, or the various places of work, which is how many of them, are learning about what's going on in Janowska. If you have a sympathetic poll, and many times the Jewish survivors will talk about, they had close conversations with sympathetic Poles or Ukrainians, where they were able to tell them what was going on in the camp. And the proximity to the ghetto meant that everybody in the ghetto knew about Janowska. And in fact, for a certain period of time, the Nazis allowed the ghetto to organize food and various parcels of supplies and bring them into the camp. So you literally had Jews from the ghetto who were able to come into the camp with packages and then leave the camp, right? So I think visibility is a fact. It's more a question of what does that mean for the people that saw that on a daily basis, you know, and what was their experience and feelings about that, which is much more difficult to sort of tease out. The last question I think is a really interesting one, and I'm kind of honored. Thank you for asking me. I don't know if it's my place to say, but how do you make it visible today? I think the first thing that it requires, and this is something that Taras and you know better than I, is how much the people in power, the authorities, are interested in making it visible. If they are interested in dedicating the time and the money and the resources to making it visible, that is really the first and most important step. Because without that, it's very difficult, right? And you're left with what we have today, which are these basically hand-created signs that are off the beaten track, and there's no sign even on the main road to turn in here to visit a memorial space, right? So, you know, step one could be, at a minimum, just having one of those brown signs like we have for the Citadel and the Arsenal Museum and everything else, you know, on the road that says Janowska Memorial Site. And then you go there and you can obviously increase the signage, the permanent signage that tells about the camp and has images of the camp and has maps of the camp, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, I think, the first sort of simple way. Another way, and this gets to your second part of the question, how do you connect Janowska to Lviv, right? Given the fact that it's this prison and you can't really have access to it. And I think that gets to this amazing exhibition that's being planned for the summer, where you're putting up signs and descriptions of historical events about the Holocaust throughout the city. And I would suggest making those permanent. You know, there should be a permanent sign out in front of Expropriation beyond just the memorial, right? Or a permanent sign at the Patelvna underpass, right? That talks about, you know, what happened there, and connects and says, or at the Sovietsky school, you know, if that site still exists. I'm not sure if that building still exists, but where that site was, the Sovietsky school was where the Jews were first taken from the ghetto and then taken to Janowska, right? Or the bathhouse, you know, that figures very prominently in survivor testimony. There are many sites within the city that appear in testimony of survivors from Janowska that would be great in highlighting the Holocaust in Lviv, and also connecting to Janowska, because most of them are in some way connected. Now, obviously, you know, nobody wants to make every sort of informational tourist signpost in Lviv about the Holocaust, right? But I think that there are ways to put up permanent sort of signs. And they don't have to be, you know, billboards. They can be smaller signs that just sort of say, you know, this building was used for this during the war, and the people ended up in Janowska, which would then make me ask some people, hey, well, maybe we should go check out Janowska and see what's there. You know, what is this place? You know, and I don't know if there are frequent large-scale commemorations at the site, you know, beyond sort of smaller Jewish commemorations. That's another way to do it. But I also think everything that the Center for Urban History is doing, you know, with the online map and the sort of online tours, all of that is doing some of this work already, which is a really great thing. And so you can keep building on that, I think. And in my mind, I'm imagining sort of the Stolpersteine phenomenon. For those who aren't familiar, it's a German artist who basically, outside of each house in Germany where people were deported, he puts a little brass cobblestone that says who they are and where they were deported and where they ended up and how they died. And they're called stumbling blocks, right? That's both sort of metaphorical, right? Sort of inconvenient memories, Now, whether the city is interested in doing something not like that, but the signs could be sort of a similar kind of concept, right? That these are uncomfortable truths about buildings that people may not even know. You know, I was talking to Taras Martinenko, and he was showing us photos. I was showing him photos from Otto Vektor's personal photo album. Otto Vektor was a key SS or Nazi administrator here, and he said, "That's my university." You know, and it was Otto Vektor was reviewing the SS Galician division that he had raised, walking past Lviv Polytechnic or whatever. You know, and so, you know, there are photographs, lots of photographs of Lviv during the Nazi era that you could sort of juxtapose with the current site. Now, again, all of that is predicated on the will to do that, and I think that can be problematic. So.
Do you have any questions?
First of all, also from my side, a big thanks that you're actually working on this, because I think it's much needed. So all my best wishes for the publication of the book. My questions that I sort of had in mind when I heard you talk. First of all, we hear a lot about like Ukrainian collaborators during the war, but I mean, when we look at like the ethnic composition of the city here before the war, we had 50% of the population being ethnic Polish. Was there any collaboration among the Polish, or was that basically it didn't happen because yeah, they were overrun by both the Soviets and the Nazis? And the second question is, we've talked a lot about people who were like the killers, but I'm also a bit interested in what actually happened to the victims and the survivors especially. What are some of the biographies that what happened to those people? So did some of them end up staying here? What did they do? Like, to which countries did they migrate? And yeah, one last remark, because you just mentioned the Stolpersteine. I think I discussed that with someone, this project, you know, and when we talked about Lviv, we actually came to the conclusion that you would probably have to actually like asphalt whole streets with those Stolpersteine here. So yeah, I think that's a bit of a problem, because in Germany, you know, it's there are like a couple people from each house where you can easily do that, but here in Lviv it just has so large proportions that I think it's not even realizable. So
Absolutely.
Although I very much would appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much. The Ukrainian and Polish collaborator situation, I think, has a complex answer. So, as far as official collaboration goes, and here we're talking Ukrainian militia or police or Schutzmannschaften, you know, people that are actually sort of in uniform working for the Nazis. That was primarily a Ukrainian phenomenon, because the Nazis, to a certain extent, at least allowed Ukrainians to believe that there would be some kind of independence for Ukraine at the end of all of this. No, they never intended that to happen, which is why immediately after, you know, Nachtigal and they came in and they took the main leadership of OUN and like shipped them back to Germany and kept them out of here, and they intentionally stomped down any real Ukrainian nationalist sort of impulses. But they were willing to sort of let them believe this if it would get them to collaborate more. And of course, anti-Semitism goes for both Poles and Ukrainians as a motivation for doing this. So I think in terms of official collaboration, that's why you don't see Poles, because the Germans really didn't install any Poles in any specific organization of collaboration, with the exception of the Blue Police in Poland is one example, but you don't see Polish Schutzmannschaften, you don't see Polish militia shooting squads, because the Poles were intended to basically be reduced to the level of slaves for the Germans. And I think the Ukrainians in the Nazi racial hierarchy ranked a little bit higher up than that. And so, you know, that doesn't make sense, but that is sort of the way that the Nazis viewed that, and they were much more willing to give Ukrainians some degree of power, put weapons in their hands. They would never do that with Poles. They would never, because they viewed Poles as people that were going to always be fighting them, which is why they, you know, behaved the way they did towards Poles. Even in places like Belarus, you know, they would install not the Polish minority once they kicked out. You know, they would look for Belarusians to install as mayors, or Russians, or Ukraine, anybody but the Poles, because they just didn't want the Poles to be involved. But that's the official level of collaboration. There are plenty of examples from survivor testimony and elsewhere of individual Polish citizens in Lviv and elsewhere blackmailing Jews, turning in Jews for money, you know, hiding them for payment until payment ran out and then turning them in, right? So this is not a phenomenon that is unique at all to Ukrainians or Poles or Lithuanians. This is a widespread. I think the distinction in collaboration is simply one of official versus unofficial or individual, right? You know, the Galician division technically should have lots of Poles in it, right? Because Galicia had a lot of Poles in it, but it's mainly Ukrainian, right? Because those are the people that Himmler is willing to trust as allies. And I think that explains the difference. It's not a difference of one was better than the other. It's just the Nazis sort of decided who could collaborate to what extent, right? And of course, many of the business owners in Lviv were Polish and had no problem using slave labor Jews in their factories and this kind of stuff. So that's another facet that, you know, those Poles that survived sort of the Soviet occupation and were able to then return to business, and Ukrainian as well, you know, were able to then use Jews as slave labor. So it's a question of official versus unofficial. As far as the survivor stories, it's hard to generalize, you know, where everybody ended up after the war. I can just give a couple examples. That 3,400 number is likely not all Jews who were native to Lviv. Lviv became a sort of central collecting point for Jews who survived the Holocaust in Galicia. They felt very unsafe in smaller towns, which is borne out by events like those in Kielce in Poland, where you have sort of pogroms after the war, where you have local populations who don't think the Jews are coming back, and then they come back and they are worried that they're going to want their stuff back and their house, etc. And so there was a tendency amongst Jews who survived to flee to the larger cities where they were more protected, there were more authorities, and then there were larger Jewish populations. I've heard the number 800 kicked around as a number of Lviv origin Jews who actually survived the Holocaust. They went in lots of different directions. So Leon Wells, who I talked about in the very beginning, he's just a fascinating guy. He ended up, for a while, he got in the good graces of this Soviet general and ended up like running black market goods back and forth to Moscow for the Soviet general for a while. And then he got put in charge of some Soviet army, Red Army agency for a while. And then he ended up deciding, as things got worse, you know, under Stalin, and as Stalin became sort of more and more anti-Semitic over time, he fled to Germany for a while, and then he left. And he got his first degree in Germany, and then he fled to the United States and lived in New Jersey. Zev Porath was originally named Wilhelm Oaks. He ended up fleeing to Israel, changing his name to Zev Porath. So you have a large community of Jews from Lviv in Israel, and they tend to group often together there. if you look, and again, part of this is just some of these survivors only appear for a minute, in the historical narrative where they're giving testimony or whatnot, and then they sort of disappear. But even in that, you can get a sort of sense for what's happening. So some are living in Germany, in the 60s. So they moved to Germany or Austria. There are at least 4 or 5 examples off the top of my head of Jews walking down the street, in some place like Munich and recognizing a camp guard and saying, that guy's a camp guard, and going and grabbing, whether it's an American during occupation or some policemen, again, having them arrested. So we know they're there. We know they're in, they eventually end up in Israel or the United States. I think very, 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 very few of them stay in Lviv because it's essentially just a giant grave. The Jews that do end up here, and this is what Taras was telling us earlier, which I think bears it out, many of them are Soviet Jews that come from other parts of the Soviet Union that were not here during the Holocaust itself, or perhaps are returning in the ironic sense that they were saved by the Soviets by being deported to Siberia or to Azerbaijan or wherever. It actually saves them from the Holocaust, and then they're able to come back at some point. But they were not sort of here during that period of time. Yeah.
Так, дуже дякую.
Thank you very much. Can you please tell us the following? Well, talking about some of the facts that you mentioned, in the beginning of February 1943, the head of Lviv ghetto was the Volksdeutsche of Polish origin, named Herzimek. He was the head of ghetto, but he was of Polish origin. So I have a question. Did you use the Black Book of the Holocaust of exterminating the Jews, edited by Vasily Grossman and Ilya Herenberg, published by the Yad Vashem and the Israeli Institute for Contemporary Society Research, published in Kiev in 1991. It's in Russian only. And this book has many examples of positive practices when not only Ukrainians but also Poles were saving the Jews. Maybe you should also mention this. Thank you.
Absolutely. No, this is a fantastic point, and I agree completely. I have used the Black Book. There's actually a couple. There's a published one and an unpublished one, or the original one, and then there's the Ehrenberg one and a different one. I haven't read the Russian language one. But I think your second point is actually very important, and it's one of those things that I mentioned during the talk that I didn't have time to discuss, in relation to what I was talking about here. But yes, absolutely, Poles and Ukrainians and even Germans participated in various acts of helping behavior and rescue behavior. And I'm happy to give one example. I think you're right that that's certainly something that should be emphasized as well, with the caveat that the reason that these people are extraordinary is that the majority of people did not do this. And so that's what makes these people special, is that most people didn't do anything. However, that doesn't, and so it's important to note these people for the simple fact that it shows, by comparison, the complicity or apathy of the rest of the people. But I'll give you a great example. So when Leon gets out of the camp in November '43, he kills a guard, and he and these 50 other folks that make it out of the Summit Commando 1005 just sort of scattered throughout Lviv. And he ends up with a guy who's native to Lviv. Leon is not native. Leon is from Stoyanov. But he ends up hanging out with this guy who is native to Lviv and knows a Pole, and who he thinks will help him. He knew him before the war. They had some kind of business relationship. And he ends up, the two of them end up going to this guy, who initially hides them. The problem with this guy is he's an alcoholic. And he always goes out to the bars at night and gets really drunk and comes home, and his wife hates that. And so his wife and this is all true, this is from, according to Leon, his wife threatens to tell everyone that he's hiding Jews if he doesn't stop going to the bars and getting drunk at night. So there's like this marital spat in which these Jews' lives are literally hanging. And the solution is that the father-in-law, unbeknownst to this guy, the drunk guy, takes Leon as well, and this other guy, and he makes it seem like they've escaped, so that even his I guess son-in-law and daughter don't know that this happened, and he hides 20 Jews in the basement or in a secret compartment underneath his barn, and he does this for a little less than a year. And 20, because he first takes in one, and he takes another one, and he takes another one, and somebody else says, "Can you get my friend?" And so he's taking a huge risk, and he has a young family. And to give you an idea of the climate of Lviv during the liberation, when the Soviets come, this man, I believe his name is Kazminsky, if I remember correctly, Kaminsky. He comes down to the little trap door and he says, "The Soviets are here, you know, you're safe, you're free, but can you please leave before the sun comes up, because I can't have my neighbors seeing Jews leaving my house, because, you know, they might do something to me." And we have examples of people being killed by their neighbors for having helped Jews in the first place. But your point is a good one, and this is just one example. There are lots of other examples of these people jumping off of trains and wandering back, because the only safe place for them really is the ghetto. So ironically, they're trying to get back into the ghetto in Lviv, and they're naked, or they're in their underclothes, and someone helps them. Someone gives them clothes, or gives them a place to stay for the night, or helps them get back into the ghetto, right? And so the real irony, I think, of every Holocaust survivor story is that as much as many of them rightfully have very hard feelings against the Poles and Ukrainians and Germans, etc., who oppressed them, almost every single one of them was helped by at least one person, and often many, over the course of their journey through the Holocaust. And I say help because it's not all rescue. You know, rescue has a higher level of assistance, but at that moment when you're outside freezing, a pair of clothes and a hot meal keeps you alive in that one moment. It's different than the guy who hides you in his basement for a year, but it's still an important behavior, and one that carried great risk for the locals. And something that I always tell my students is that I think sometimes we have sort of an extraordinary assumption of what is normal behavior, and an expectation that everyone is a hero, and everyone is not a hero. And so, particularly in Eastern Europe, you know, if you are caught helping Jews, it's most likely that you will be shot and your whole family will be shot. And this happened frequently. And there's records of this, is another set of records that we have of in Lviv even, of people who are arrested, non-Jews who are arrested for helping Jews, and it tells a little about how they did that and then what happened to them, and it's usually negative. And so there is a very real risk to doing this. It doesn't absolve people who particularly are taking advantage of it, but it makes it difficult. It makes it a difficult decision for someone to make, particularly when they have a family involved. But in the end, you know, like I said in the beginning, what makes rescuers exceptional is the fact that most people did nothing. And we can argue forever, we can talk a lot about reasons, and some are valid and some are not, but the point is, in the end, only a very few people rescued or helped. But you're 100% correct to point out, and in the book I obviously will point out those people that helped. And there were even Germans, for example, in the HKP 547, which was a German Army motor pool unit, who helped Jews, gave them false documents, you know. Even those people that ran factories and let the Jews stay there on Sundays rather than going back to the camp and being abused for a whole day is a form of assistance, right? So just like perpetration, and collaboration, I think rescue and assistance runs along a large spectrum, and that it's important to tease that out.
Я думаю, що час вже добігає до кінця, якщо немає.
I think we are running out of time, so if there are no more questions, we would like to express our gratitude to Dr. Beorn and thank you for this discussion. I would like to remind to you that this discussion is going to continue throughout this year in different institutions in the city. We are going to have multiple events and activities to commemorate the Holocaust victims and the Janowska victims. We will inform on that, so stay tuned to our announcement. Thank you for coming.